Guys ready? Let's get started.
I had a appointment yesterday.
So yeah, you have to push the.
Yep. So Lois is gonna go in with you.
Somehow I ended up sitting up here.
It's a toughie, isn't it? You say, am I gonna trick you out for 5 more years if you're gone and I'm spending wood in your place and whatever. That sounds good.
You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. Sorry.
Don? Ready? Tom?
Okay. So this is a follow-up to the EOA hearing we had last month and some other follow-up items on the economic development policies that were carryover from the February 10th work session. We thought we would jump in with the EOA questions. These mainly were regarding the industrial lands and the cargo forecast and marine terminal needs and testimony we heard about the message we send by picking a low cargo forecast and or a medium cargo forecast and how that affects the industrial land demand and the shortfalls and the other strategies. And so in your memo and what I'll walk through today is sort of a deeper explanation on the cargo forecasts and how that translates into different industrial land demands and in different shortfalls. And then we're looking for guidance from you as to which, which cargo forecasts we should go with in the EOA to bring forward as the recommended EOA. Just a reminder, the EOA and the outline and the guidance we get from state rules is it's a supply and demand analysis. The sort of what we're trying to achieve is designate land suitable to meet the identified needs. Part of it is a employment growth forecast, that's the demand side, and then we have a land development capacity side, the supply side, and then we have that reconciliation, which is the Section 4 report of the EOA on how we can get everything to balance. We've taken the larger jobs forecast from Metro and allocated it across the city based on the different employment sectors and the different geographies. And what we're really focused on is the 32,000 jobs in the industrial area, and because that's where we have our most challenging land supply needs, shortfalls, capacity issues. Where we are right now with the proposed plan in terms of citywide is with the changes in the Southeast Quadrant plan going forward, we have a pretty good surplus of capacity in the central city. With all of the industrial land changes that we have built into the plan, including the brownfield redevelopment, including the golf course map designations, not including West Hayden Island, we have a slight 100-acre surplus of industrial capacity across all of the industrial districts. We have plenty of employment capacity in our neighborhood commercial areas, and this 800 acres of surplus is after you account for all of the residential development. So we have lots of capacity in those districts. And then after we go through with our proposed map designations and new zoning code for the campus institutions, which is also in your packet, we'll have a slight surplus for those areas as well. So really where we're still sort of on the edge and don't have much of a buffer is the overall industrial land demand. So there's really two components of the demand. One has to do with jobs and the job growth, and then the other is with traded sector facilities, and that is primarily the primary variable there is what to do about identifying the future need for marine terminals. And that need is really based on two factors. One is the volume of commodities that we think will flow through there, and the facility type. And I'll get into this, but you know, the assumptions can really be based on three different facility types: a very sort of compact infill, what you see, like for example, the Dreyfus grain elevator in the Rose Garden right next to the Broadway Bridge. That's an older facility, but you're seeing reinvestment in that. It's very tight. You don't see a lot of those types of facilities built new today, but you do see a lot of reinvestment in that area. A modern facility has a bigger footprint. It has more of a rail yard on site and not relying on shuttling trains back and forth to off-site facilities. And then the largest footprint is one that has a rail loop where you can bring 100-car unit trains through, and it's very efficient for offloading whatever product you have. But obviously, and as you know from the West Hayden Island discussion, those rail loops have a very large footprint. Yeah.
I want to make one point about West Hayden Island just to burn it in, is that the numbers we're talking about have already taken West Hayden Island off of the ledger. So don't confuse this discussion with the West Hayden Island policy discussion that we'll have later. This is purely about if you've already taken West Hayden Island off the table, what are the commodity options left?
That was good, Claire.
So this little flow chart was in your packet, the May 1st staff memo for today, and what we tried to explain at the EOA hearing on how we arrive at sort of the estimated land needs for marine terminals. But basically, you know, there are studies that look at the whole Lower Columbia ports and how that commodity tonnage is expected to grow over the next 20 years. A certain amount of that tonnage gets allocated to Portland, and then once we look at you know, the different commodity types, the grain versus the autos versus the bulk versus the liquid bulk, and how that breaks out within Portland. And then for each of those commodity types, there's different terminal sizes. And then there's also the other factor, which you'll see here in the next slide, you know, how much capacity is there in our existing terminals? And how much can they absorb of that new, that growth? And because we have actually quite a bit of capacity in the existing terminals to absorb a lot of that growth.
Does that include retrofits, like the potential for?
No, no. We have not tried to estimate what the, especially on the private terminal side, like Dreyfus,
Right.
you know, what is their capacity to squeeze more out, and what that market, that enhanced continuing market demand will push them to do those types of investments. But what's telling is that, I think it was in the PBA testimony for last time, all of their examples of reinvestment in the harbor, the Dreyfus, the Daimler, all of that is reinvestment in existing facilities. That's not expansion on new sites, but it's that intensification reinvestment in response to the demand. So this is how when we break out that Lower Columbia cargo forecast down to Portland and looking at the different commodity types, and what you have here in this first column is the existing terminal capacity, and then you have three different sort of cargo volume forecasts, a low, a medium, and a high. But what, you can look at the totals, but what we also do, and you'll see in the next couple of slides and tables, is we're mainly looking at it across the rows to see what capacity is there, and if we go with the medium forecast, where are we going to be short for which specific commodities? Yeah, Chris.
So I have a question about the rail loop configuration and efficiency. If I recall from our Pembina discussion, propane would be liquid bulk, right? Is that the right category?
Yes.
Sorry, I think it's on. I'll make sure I talk into it. So, they were not using a rail loop, but it looked like they had a pretty efficient offloading configuration by essentially splitting a unit train in half on two spurs and offloading that to their storage tank. Is that kind of configuration perhaps not as efficient as a rail loop, but could it be more efficient than sort of existing conditions? Is there something in between what we have and a rail loop that increases efficiency?
That's kind of what
Right.
we referred to as the modern facilities, that not all new facilities are going to have rail loops, but they're more efficient than drivers, for example.
So how far would such facilities get us towards medium versus the low that we
We'll
picked today?
we'll show
Okay.
you here an example of that in a minute. Yeah.
Can you just clarify what is break bulk?
Break bulk is, and Tom from the port can confirm for me, are the sort of manufactured bigger, bulkier stuff like steel girders, as opposed to dry bulk is raw commodities like potash.
He's nodding.
Get that right? All right.
Stuff that doesn't fit in a container.
So that seems really low, like half. Is there something driving that?
Well, again, this is the capacity of the existing terminals, and it just shows that based on current activities and growing those out, and what is expected is that's not a huge growing part of the Portland commodity flow, at least, compared to, say, the autos, which they're projected to grow, and yet the existing terminal capacity is not there.
So that suggests we have an allocation problem with how we're using the terminal capacity, or configuration problem or something?
I wouldn't say it's a problem as much as it's based on what's out there in the port today and how that operates, and based on those existing facilities. What it does show is, this is where the existing facilities where we're short capacity. And so this is how we built those, what you'll see, different terminal need estimates based on not only do you pick the low or the most likely or the medium forecast scenario, but then, okay, so how much land do I need to accommodate that auto or if it is the medium, what the grain or the dry bulk are needed.
Okay, so one more thing. So what I was looking at it would be if we have all this double the capacity we need in break bulk, wouldn't we be able to change some of that break bulk processing facility to meet the needs of the other places where we actually need stuff? Is that?
You gotta,
There's a couple factors there. One is that there are a lot of sunk costs in those existing facilities that you can't just transition to different types of commodities. The different commodity movements require different kind of berths. If you're doing containers, there's Terminal 6 is a container terminal, and it has a vertical sheet pile wall, and it has a tremendous amount of infrastructure for handling containers. It's not an easy proposition to just shift commodities there. Similarly, the liquid bulk, the oil tank farms, you can't just convert those to handling grain. There's some wiggle room there, but not very much because of the tremendous amount of sunk costs and the fact that not all of it is in public ownership either. It's a private company, and it's really not our choice how they reallocate it.
I think another example of that is on Terminal 4, there's an older Cargill grain elevator site that's not being used today. But one of the barriers to repurposing that is the demolition cost of that old grain elevator, or even then refurbishing it to add grain capacity if that's where the demand is. So it is, a lot of it has to do with that sunk cost, and it's not just an easy proposition to change it over to something else. So we then are now looking at, well, what are the different site need assumptions to fill in these specific gaps? And that's where we begin to look at, and this is for the medium or the most likely cargo forecast, where if you take this shortfall and begin to look at different marine terminal facility assumptions, whether it's a compact or a modern facility or a modern with a rail loop, what are those different land footprint needs imply? The 2012 version of the EOA was using these numbers, and that's how, again, this is a 2040 number that was adjusted for to 2035 horizon and adjusted to account for some overlap double counting with the employment demand, and that's how the 390 became a 350 acre demand, and that's what really fed into that large industrial land shortfall. Sort of based on the direction of not including West Hayden Island, led us to, in the current EOA, led us to look at the low cargo forecast with a modern facility for autos, which is where we're most short, which came up with an overall shortfall in the harbor access land area of 38 acres. If we go back and look at this medium forecast, but say, you know what, we're going to do, it's going to be mostly infill and reinvestment and very tight, efficient footprints, then we can come up with a scenario, this so-called medium compact scenario, where we are up to a 48 acre shortfall. And then this is the 2012 version. There's one in between here. It's probably on the order of 200 acres. But I think what we're mainly saying is anything more than 48 acres gets us sort of beyond the comfort level and trying to shift some of those jobs into other industrial areas and pushes us more into what we would say is a Goal 9 exception and having to explain more clearly more why West Hayden Island is not available to meet this marine terminal land need.
Yeah, a question on the modern with rail loop. I'm surprised Chris didn't bring this up. I'm channeling him here, I guess. My recollection, and understanding West Hayden Island's off the table, my recollection was that all of the conversations regarding West Hayden Island were predicated on the loop and the CRC. Is that correct? That's my understanding.
There
Which
was
isn't-
there was a discussion of both. The loop was considered a baseline need to. The advisory committee at the time agreed that if you're going to develop West Hayden Island, it should have the most efficient loop system possible, and that was we ended up with a roughly 300-acre footprint for that, give or take 10 or 20 acres. It was a rail facility, so the CRC from the port's perspective was not a critical component. The CRC became an issue in terms of traffic impact.
Right.
And how do you get, even though there's a small number of trucks serving the island, there still is an issue getting onto Hayden Island without the CRC. So CRC came up in the traffic analysis and the neighborhood impact discussion, but it wasn't a core assumption for why we were doing the facility to begin with, because it was a rail facility primarily.
Tom, as you move, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, no, I was going back to your boxes before you get to the final analysis, and it just seems like, so my real question is the word feasible is up there, is it feasible to have the loop, presuming that, I mean, I don't know how many other sites are available out there to have a loop on it. Is it feasible to have the loop without having CRC or something comparable? Do they go together?
The loop doesn't use or require the CRC. It's
get
a separate
that, but-
issue. There aren't, if what you're asking is there aren't any sites we've found in the city that, other than West Hayden Island, that would fit a loop, if that's what you're asking.
My question's more broad, Tom. Are these numbers you're giving us now settled? Are people who have these needs in agreement with these projections? Reality says that when you project automobiles, and I'm looking at what's going on out there now, I don't know whether I'm missing something, but is there something you can see in the future that isn't there now that projects these numbers?
I would say no. The numbers are constantly changing. They're working on a new Lower Columbia cargo commodity forecast right now. And, you know, so that's why one of the things with the whole EOA is, you know, the economy is constantly changing. I mean, this forecast didn't even foresee Pembina and propane, you know, market demand wanting to come here. So it's one of the reasons why we continually emphasize the need to revisit these every 5 to 7 years as we go through different business cycles, to check and make these mid-course corrections as to you know, how are we doing, what new commodity has popped up and is now hot. You know, the other example related to the Pembina proposal is the fact that Honda wasn't importing as many autos as they used to, because they're building more in Mexico. And how does that change? And that freed up capacity that they could reuse for something else. And so, no, there are constantly new information, new numbers to make adjustments
This
to.
is the best information we have right now, though.
Yeah, which I'm happy to accept, but also with that tongue in cheek, saying we're doing this in a sense of a kind of a movable platform. And the platform is based on a lot of factors that could not take 3 to 5 years, but could happen in 6 minutes or 6 months. Well, 6 months, not 6 minutes. So I understand what you're doing and projecting as best you can. I keep urging my fellow commissioners to urge you guys to think of new and innovative ways to allocate land for industrial use that we have.
And I think you're seeing that in the marketplace, and the market responds more. I mean, it's interesting through this whole process, and even the previous discussion about the power of the map, when it's actually the market that's driving many of these innovations. And that somewhat gets into, is picking a low forecast sending a message, or is the market demand going to recognize that we want to be in this location, we need to be in this location because of rail access or freeway access or some other factors, regardless of what little number we put in the EOA. There are a whole host of other factors that make up those market decisions.
Gary and then Karen. Gary?
Tom, I just want to make sure I'm interpreting this chart correctly. The 270 acres on automobiles, that's above what's already there?
Yes.
And I was kind of surprised at how large a number that is compared to some of the other commodities. Is that basically the surface parking for retaining automobiles till they're
Yeah,
go up to dealers?
and in the last session, I think Andre was pushing us to sort of talk about, with all of these options, what's the sweat or the heavy lift to make it happen, and really the difference between a modern facility and a compact facility would be essentially a parking garage at one of the terminals, so that you could begin to stack them. Well, that's as we know from mixed-use development, structured parking is a lot more expensive than surface parking, and somehow the market or the port or the public or Portland is going to have to somehow figure out those added costs to accommodate that demand. And is that public subsidy that the city puts in to make that happen, or does that demand go somewhere else where it's cheaper to have those surface lots
When
where
we're
the land
rationing
is
down
available?
Parking lots, we're using 270 acres for cars.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Karen?
So last time we met, there was a lot of testimony and conversation with the public and with this commission regarding the marine cargo forecast numbers. And and I'm looking at the March proposed draft of the EOA. And it talks about, despite a general decline in industrial employment between 2002 and 2008, that's a loss of 1.3%, cargo tonnage in the Portland Harbor went up 4.1% per year during the same era. And so there was a lot of conversation by us and by the public saying that the number that was selected was too low, and that it was actually forecasted to be higher. And what we asked for, and I'm hoping will happen at some point, was what those numbers were based on, and perhaps if there's a better number.
That's what he's doing.
That's what
That's
this series of tables is designed to show
So
you
I guess
those
my-
choices.
So.
This is the methodology.
So my problem then, and I guess I could be the only one sitting at this table who didn't get that, and I'm willing to own that, is because there aren't any percentages on here. I'm just getting lost in trying to figure out how percentages were arrived at, because I'm looking, these documents are in this old document.
Yeah.
Because I pulled it out of my bag. So it's the same document as I'm looking at. This isn't new. So what I guess I'm needing, and maybe nobody else is needing it, and I'm fine with that. You can just say, figure it out, Karen, that's all right. I'm trying to see how this fits into the 1.3% versus the 4.1% versus how all that works together. I can read the numbers, I get the numbers.
So I can make an attempt at that. The total tonnage, when you heard some testimony that of 3% increase in overall tonnage, and these projections have a range, obviously. And so when you look at what's been happening overall versus different commodities, there are different percentages, right? So the overall percentage of the tonnage in the harbor the testimony you received is accurate, that there's kind of a 3%, 4% trend.
Right, there's a swing.
It isn't that way when you look at individual commodities. So they vary. And the 3% is closer to the medium forecast when you look at the overall tonnage. Our low forecast is closer to 1.5% growth. So if that helps you calibrate these
It
columns.
does help.
That said, when you look at the individual commodities, again, they vary from that. So if you look at autos versus grain is growing more on the higher end of that. Autos has been a little bit more flat in practice in recent years, but it varies by commodity, and we could
Right.
we could describe that more detailed.
So, but I guess what my concern is that if I look at the 470, that's in the medium range. But what was reported to us was in the low range. And so that's, I think, part of my confusion. I can't say it's part of anybody else's. But we obviously didn't go to the high range. We went in the middle today. We're looking at the middle range. But the report from last time was on the low range. And so I'm just trying to get a feeling as to where we're going to end up landing on this conversation.
So you have a choice, essentially, if, assuming West Hayden Island is off the table and you're not going to do a rail loop because we don't have another location, then you're choosing between 1 and 2 up there. You're either going to pick the low forecast
Yep.
with a modern facility, which is
Right.
the way we wrote that EOA, or you're going to say, we're not comfortable with the low forecast, use the medium, but in order to do that, you would have to, the only way to do that without getting more land would be to argue that more compact facilities are feasible. So those are kind of your choices. And I think Andre asked, what is the sweat that it takes to get there? And it essentially is, there's an investment you would have to make in order to make those compact facilities market viable. That's either a subsidy or some other investment to make that work. The market wouldn't necessarily do that by itself because there are cheaper places in other cities where they could locate without doing that.
So to put it in things that I understand, we have a choice between the 1%, kind of 1.4%, and the 3% being number 2. But to do number 2, and the reason I wanted to understand what the sweat was is because that is like the brownfields. We're going to have to make public investment, and I'm not sure whether it's the city or the port or the state, but someone's going to have to make a public investment to make these sites more compatible and marketable to customers. And we just need, I at least want to understand what that investment, not the dollars, but that it's a public investment and that we're making that choice at a higher number. But there is also associated risk with that higher risk because we're asking for, again, more dollars.
And just to emphasize that point, that between options 1 and 2, those investments build on each other, right? So option 1 includes all of the $100 million worth of brownfield, reinvestment and the freight infrastructure that's already in the TSP. And what we're saying is to do option number 2 with the compact, you got to go beyond that. We need more freight. We need even public subsidy and facilities to make them operationally flow on a compact footprint versus, we need to help subsidize the demolition of the grain elevator at Terminal 4 and that kind of stuff to be able to attract the market here to take advantage of those more constrained compact footprints.
So there's a number of places in this conversation that need this kind of decision-making because you've taken West Hayden Island off the table ostensibly. But if you're saying you also need a rail loop, then you have to think about that again.
Well,
and
we're
then
not-
we talked about brownfields last time, and there were people saying, no, that's not a viable investment. I'm just saying,
Yeah,
those are the
yeah.
things I observed.
So we're not, I guess what staff is recommending either option 1 or 2. Number 3 puts West Hayden Island back into the loop and into our conversation. And
Right.
Hence my question about the CRC.
See, so my understanding is we don't want to put West Hayden Island into the conversation again. So we're really discussing, based upon our last conversation, there was a conversation of what would it take to be higher at a 3% based upon public testimony that we heard, that what would it take for us to get there? And I think Tom and Eric have laid out those options and that building of investment. I got to go to Mike and then
Thanks.
Maggie.
Yeah, and actually the word sweat came up because I was using an analogy, I guess, in that back in the day when we were talking about the urban growth boundary decisions that Metro was going to make, there was a lot of conversation from the home builders and others that we needed to expand the UGB, and the city of Portland and others that were concerned about the urban growth boundary expansion said, no, we need to break a sweat. We need to show that we are going to more efficiently utilize the land inside the urban growth boundary. And both options 1 and 2 are saying that we are serious about that. And yeah, it's going to take some investment, just like it takes investment to build housing and commercial development and so on and so forth, and that industrial development should not be held harmless from the same sort of effort that requires some heavy lifting.
Maggie?
So in terms of the difference between 1 and 2 in terms of public subsidy, are you looking at a similar rate of investment? You said $100 million for brownfield remediation for option 1. Would it be at that
So-
similar rate for option 2?
It would be the 100 million for brownfields plus additional subsidy and investment in the marine facilities
Is there-
to achieve that compact footprint.
Is there any way to estimate right now what that investment would be?
No.
Okay. And then question number 2 is, if we were to pick the low forecast, would this prevent, because it would be it would directly translate to mapping and code, right, for mapping off industrial land. Would it be feasible for, say, the private market in the end to subdivide lots and be more efficient in terms of land use on their own? I mean, would it
I don't
preclude
think selecting option 1 necessarily changes the map or the
Okay.
code in any way. I think it does, it reflects the constrained capacity that we have, and that it is the response to go beyond that low forecast is up to the market to make the reinvestment decisions that, such as we see at Dreyfus, and for the city to be prepared to help support those investments in the way we can, and whether that's through regulations or development review process or investment in freight infrastructure to help make getting to those facilities or whatever we can do to encourage that part of making that a successful operation.
So the existing map that we've put on the table is within 50 acres of either option 1 or 2, and really it meets option 1 and it could meet option 2 if we're willing to have compact facilities and make those investments so that becomes economically feasible. That's really the difference. It's not really a mapping difference.
Right.
Option 3 would be a mapping difference because our current map doesn't achieve that.
So then we're not preventing industrial development or industrial use if we pick option 1 in any of those additional 10 acres. Because it would just be like, when it comes to it, the city or private industry can invest.
Right.
Okay.
Michelle?
So if we look for 2, would staff come back with additional policies to support the feasibility of compact development, such as encouraging subsidies and other investments?
Yeah, we would probably look at that and see if there's other things that we might want to make a stronger case, add to the TSP, financially constrained investment list, or you'll need to factor that in when we talk about other things like the industrial land retention policy and the, assessing the impact of future regulations that would affect the harbor access lands and things like that.
Mike?
Well, I think the critical comment that Tom made is the reality is this reflects that we're up against it with regard to how much land is available. And, at the last hearing, people were expressing a lot of angst that we're sending the wrong message and that Portland isn't open for business, which I totally reject. These are numbers. There was a methodology, and that's what we asked for staff to come back
That's right.
and give us a methodology in terms of how they got to the low forecast. And the reality is we have a lack of land. It's not sending a signal to anybody. Well, it is. It's saying it's saying this is the reality. This is what we have available, and we have a 10-acre difference between 1 and 2. I guess my question is, when it comes down to it, in the final analysis, can the city of Portland justify or document the rationale in terms of how we got to number 2
That's what I'm
versus
asking.
the low forecast?
Michelle?
I think it does send a message when we don't reflect the growth we've had so far, those growth trends, and somehow accommodate for it. And so that's why I was asking about staff coming back with policies that would say, okay, if we're going to say we're land constrained, we're also willing to make the investments to help make this compact development happen, because we are looking at the equity issues and the jobs. And yes, we have the urban growth boundary, and that was a great thing, but we're also fighting affordable housing issues. So there have been costs, and we haven't necessarily made the investments that we needed to make to really accomplish what we said we wanted as a whole. So I would rather see us go with the medium forecast, which reflects my understanding what the analysis said was the most likely, and then actually make the commitment to do the hard work to make compact development work if we can't find a way to make modern work. And I don't know if there are still creative ways to make modern work. If you could do subsidies where if you got a willing landowner in an appropriate location that had commercial property that was willing to let that be not fight a rezoning to industrial, maybe you can actually get more land within the urban growth boundary. But I do think that we do send a message when we say, yeah, we've been growing at this rate, but we're going to pull back in our projections.
Other discussion? Maggie?
Just one last question. I'm going to go off of what Michelle said, but so would this, if we pick 2, would that, I mean, that's 10 acres, would that put any pressure on development of housing? It wouldn't, because it would all be on pretty much land that's only going to be used for industrial use. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Correct.
So back to Mike's, I guess, comment. The issue of number 2, we can still justify that relative to goal 9.
I'm sorry, say that again?
We can justify number 2 relative to goal 9.
With both of these, we will make the case. I'm sure someone will question that case, and we will
That's a
have
different
to make
question.
the case
That's
to
a
the city
different question.
council and have to
Yeah.
make the case to LCDC and
But we're
Yes.
we're more confident on 1 and 2 that we can make a good case, I guess is,
yes.
okay.
I have a question.
Karen?
I was looking at a photograph I took of the board on April 28th, and it had an industrial land capacity chart that showed 50, this is your strategy, 50 acres for industrial land
That one.
retention. That's the one.
Now we can all.
Now
we
you
can all
can
see it.
all see it, not just, I just take pictures of stuff I find important. This one was important to me. But anyway, so you've got 50, 124, 192, that's about 366. And then you had airport golf courses, which according to testimony, didn't seem like was panning out. So in the discussion of this slide, is this where you're pretty well landing in your strategy?
Yes. All of these numbers
Golf course.
go into, you know, you assume all of these numbers and you're still 38 or 48 acres
And that was
short of
why I
harbor
was
access
looking at
lands.
it, was because to me, it showed that there was a delta between those. So, because that first slide only, even if you took off the golf course, I mean, if you took off the golf course, it was still less.
So if you decide not to do any of these things, you have to do the math to modify that number.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
and then you
Yeah.
go back to
Yes.
this table. All of those four strategies go into this number. And even with this number, we're saying the specialized use of harbor access land is still short. And that's where saying, you know, over time, that constrained capacity will shift some of the non-river dependent activities to adjacent areas. But those adjacent areas still have capacity. If we adjust our brownfield assumption or our golf course assumption, they're not gonna have that capacity to absorb that shift.
And that's when you.
That's the tightness of the land supply.
And that's when you'd have to then shift to other sectors of the economy, like retail or office or something. Right now, any job shifts we're making are within that industrial employment sector.
Teresa?
Okay, so a couple of comments. A forecast is just that. It's a plan. Sales guys forecast high, manufacturing guys forecast in the middle, and the financial people, you know, they want the best, but they don't want to make the reservation to spend the money. So now we're talking about what's the reservation we're willing to make. And one thing I think we haven't really kind of put into the mix is we're talking a 20-year time span, and I think with the rate of industrial improvement and efficiencies and technologies that are coming through, that we will see some improvement in how to move freight. I know it's not had very much attention at all because we've had a ton of land. Fossil fuels are cheap. We've zoomed things all around. That's not going to continue on the same plane, in my opinion. So I think we will see some improvements that industry will make to cut their own costs that will give us some benefit.
Mm-hmm.
Other comments? So I just want to make sure, do people understand what we're looking at? The low was the original forecast, Tom. Just to be clear, Tom, the low was the original forecast that was brought to us previously, correct?
No, well, define previous. So this current March version is based on number one.
Yes.
If you want to go to number two, we would like to know today, so we can rewrite it and get the document out, and in June and July, you can see it and recommend it.
Okay. Chris?
So in all your tables for 1 and 2, you haven't connected them to either jobs or value added to the community in some dollar term. Do you have any of that data?
The jobs stay the same. There's still about 1,900 new jobs in the harbor because of the methodology, the way we did it. We looked at job needs and we looked at cargo needs. And so this is just cargo flowing through and that, so we're adjusting that dial.
So if we move from the low forecast to the medium forecast, the jobs don't change?
The jobs don't change.
Steve doesn't seem to agree.
Yeah, we're talking throughput.
Jobs, yeah. Okay, can you come up to the mic and say that? Thank you, Steve.
Tom said was correct. For harbor access lands, the job number does not change, but the mix of jobs changes. There would be fewer marine terminal jobs and more of the other industrial facility jobs.
If we went to 2.
And
Right.
is the
Under two.
value-added contribution of those jobs different or the same?
I don't know that we have that in our methodology
Let
because
me phrase the question differently. So if we were to make the public investments to get from 1 to 2, what's the return to the community?
it's because we're talking about commodity movement, the primary return is the flow of money into the community, not the job. So you're talking about tax revenue and things like that.
Okay, well, if we're going to look at that in a month or two, I'd like to have some estimates of that.
To just clarify your question, you're asking if there's a difference between the revenue to the community between 1 and 2. I'm not certain that we have enough information to be able to tell you that, but we can look into it.
Okay.
It would seem to me,
You want to know what the income
it would seem to me if you're going to increase, if you're going to go to number 2, and we're going to put into this kind of sweat equity conversation of public investment, the rate of return is going to have to be higher. I mean, you're because you have a higher investment in that, even from the private side, even if you have to subsidize it. So the value added, whether it's just a straight commodity or it's some other commodity that is coming out of Eastern Oregon, is going to have to be higher. It's going to be higher to get off the port because just a low commodity is not going to have enough revenue to justify the higher value added because we're creating a higher asset level.
So Chris, another way to answer your question maybe, which Steve just whispered in my ear, is that if you look at the commodity type, the difference between the low forecast and the high forecast is that the low is just autos. The medium is adds additional facilities for grain and dry bulk. So, you know, the autos are exporting and importing through Portland, and there are some local jobs related to that. And it's the same as the grain and the dry bulk. So it's a little bit of both. You're getting but because the medium is more of the Eastern Oregon or raw material mix, it may not be that different.
No. So, additional questions? Gary?
Just a comment. I really appreciate all the work that you guys have done on this, and I feel much more comfortable with the forecasts. Having gone through today's session, it's all making sense to me. And the other thing is that it's given me a greater comfort in feeling like we're within the margin of error in terms of the amount of land needed versus the instability in the shipping forecasts. Those can be remarkably spot on, and they, as you pointed out, they can be remarkably different depending on what's going on in the business cycle and unanticipated world events. So this actually makes me feel more comfortable and less inclined to say, how can we push to the next level? Because the next 10 acres out of the 350 acres is pretty small percentage change.
Is
So-
there a sense of the room that we want to take on
That
this?
was my next question. Is there, okay, Howard? Well, is there a sense of, I guess, staying with the original or moving to the higher?
I'm fine with the low forecast myself.
Medium. Stay. I think there's consensus to stay where we are. I think, I will just say, I think it's a bad message, but
It doesn't sound like
there's not an entire consensus, but I think there's the majority of people are, the majority is,
But
unless,
the message doesn't have to be bad. The message is we believe that industry can innovate and take less land because land is not the heart of their business, right?
but you're not putting the policy with the innovation in the request, and that's the problem. We're we're not asking industry and the public to sweat to get to that next level, which is marginal at best. And Gary's right, there's not a 10-acre difference. And we acknowledge, to Mike's point, we're kind of at the limit. And now we're saying we're not going to put the policy there to push industry to do more, be more efficient, to do those things.
This isn't a policy.
No, but the number two would be asking them to come up with policy to really push industry to do that. We're not asking them to do that with number one.
I should just let good enough stand, but I mean, it seems to me that the innovation will come with a constrained land supply. Innovation will follow.
Or jobs will leave.
Yeah, I mean.
It's gonna be- it'll be one or the other.
We're
Requesting,
not talking about jobs here, that we're talking about throughput. We're talking
But
about.
you're-
We're talking about the jobs that you have on the industrial land. We're talking about the jobs that spin off of the industrial land. We're talking about the money those people spend. I mean, it is more than just 40 jobs on one piece of property.
Yeah.
We're not talking about Pembroke.
Well, it's yeah, no, but we're not talking about Pivot, but it is, to me, a message of investment, of public investment, of whether the public is willing to put sweat equity into helping private industry grow in a very constrained and efficient manner on reuse and better utilization of land.
Absolutely.
And we're not asking to do that in number one. We're just saying you're kind of on your own. And that's a message.
Well, yeah, I'm always worried about the message. And so, I'll just kind of pose one question. It makes sense. I'm all about having people innovate, but is that innovation affordable? And are we restricting growth in Portland? Those are the two things that are in my mind. But then as I think about the difference between 1 and 2, not huge. And 2, I think, is a little tougher test than 1. So I'm in the one column now, but I just don't want to set up a situation where we're restricting growth and growth of good family wage jobs. And I know this isn't about jobs, but I'm saying it anyway. And so because
That's your right.
yeah, that I'm right and you're wrong. But I think, Mike, where we do agree is on kind of prompting innovation and prompting efficient use of land. I think we're both in complete agreement with that, and that's why I'm landing on column 1.
I would just say, Tom said it, this is going to be reviewed every 5 years to take another look at it. And saying number 2 initially, if it's too much of a push, I don't disagree. We're looking for innovation. It's how you communicate that message of innovation and partnership and growth. And I don't think number 1 sends that message. I'm not disagreeing you need to send the message, and I think it's imperative you send the message and you be strong in the message. It's just, I don't think number 1 sends it. And in 5 years, you got to look at this again because you got to adjust the forecast because we heard that it is just that, a forecast.
And one thing to consider, and we're going to have a discussion about the goal 9, the further you push it, the closer you get to that threshold.
But we also heard we were comfortable.
I'm just saying.
I'm just saying, yeah.
It's,
All right.
it's kind of a strange, eerie comfort, but it is comfortable.
All right, we're going to move on.
Can I ask a quick question? We skipped over the first item on the agenda
Well,
was industrial lands retention policy, so we're going to come back
to that. We're coming back to that. Now we get to go to West Hayden Island.
Oh, boy.
Number 3, and in your memo on page 7, and I guess this is a question or confirmation on the policy language in policy 641, which is on page 7. Again, the proposal is to map designation of rural farm forest. Policy 641 provides some guidance for future annexation. We are not including West Hayden Island in the previous discussion, the previous BLI. We're not counting any capacity on there because we don't think it will be ready by 2035. And then given sort of the discussion previous to this on, we were asked to come up with a number of different policy options for this framework. We have 4 of them in the memo, just briefly. One is, 3 of them deal with retaining the farm forest map designation and what you do with the policy. And so we could, given the sort of what we perceive as the lack of consensus on the commission, we could delete the policy and just be silent about the guidance for future annexation. That's what we have today in the current comp plan and what sort of would be the launching point for a new planning process. We could amend the policy, which is one of the directions we got from the February 10th work session, which is to add more language, and that's included in your memo on page 8. We could add more language about the community, addressing community impacts. Third option is we could delete the references, the first 2 bullets, sub-bullets, that talk about the 300-500 acre split between industrial uses and open space uses, and not offer that guidance as part of a future annexation plan. And then the 4th option was to go in sort of a different direction, which is delete the policy and map it as open space. Each of those has different levels where we think the primary policy barrier to all of this is what kind of reaction we'll get from the Metro Council in their review and the compliance with the Urban Growth Management Functional Plan, which is not clear in terms of the direction it gives us, and often leaves it to the city's discretion in a future area plan, which we haven't done and still need to do before we determine the fate of West Hayden Island. So I'll leave it that as a way to set up the discussion.
Mike?
Well, I actually came in here predisposed to recommending we just take it off altogether and be silent about it, frankly, because we've already demonstrated we don't need West Hayden Island for the purposes of this process. So that's where I'd go. I'm not sure that there's a lot of appetite on the commission for that particular approach or not. At a minimum, I think we need to leave the bullets in, so I definitely would oppose that. And in fact, I think it does make sense to add the additional language that was in option 2 regarding additional community impacts. So I'll just throw out, my preference would be just to take it out and be silent on it.
Leave it as it's currently in.
Just take all reference out and just not even refer to it.
So option 1.
Well, it's not, that option isn't up here.
No, that's option 1.
That's option 1.
Option 1 just keeps the current map designation, keeps it farm forest.
Delete the whole policy.
Think about it.
I am thinking about it.
Gary?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Tom, in looking at these 4 options, I came away reading the memo that number 4 would be probably the most likely to provoke a Metro reaction. Is that?
Yes.
Was I
That's why I
reading that
didn't go
correctly?
Option 4 is most in conflict with the Metro policies.
And we're talking specifically around the 1980 and subsequent designations of the industrial lands of regional significance?
Yes.
Okay.
Chris?
So I guess I'm wondering about a hybrid option. Probably no secret, people know that I would prefer full protection for West Hayden Island as the ultimate future course. If as a commission we wanted to get moving in that direction, could we use option number 1 and then include it in our recommendation to City Council that council should take up with Metro a change in the functional plan? So not put an assumption of a change in our comp plan, but recommend to council that they go pursue that separately. Is there any legislative bottleneck to that kind of a course?
So let me clarify, a change to what?
So that we would ultimately want Metro's functional plan to reflect West Hayden Island as a natural resource.
So, but that would be part of a recommendation, but you would be option 1.
Right, so I'm saying 1 plus a recommendation.
Okay.
Right.
But it's deleting it, basically.
Well,
Let's call it what it is.
yeah.
It's deleting it.
Yeah. Maggie?
This is
Yeah.
probably a very redundant question. Can you differentiate farm forest versus open space one more time for me? So what's the difference?
Yeah, so farm forest is the most equivalent to the current county designation and zoning that's out there. And so we would essentially say we're maintaining the status quo. We haven't determined the future fate of West Hayden Island. Open space is a much stronger protection designation and zoning that says, no, development is not going to happen out here.
Because farming would technically be a form of development.
Well, yes, and it would still leave open the question of what its future use would be once it was annexed into the city.
Other, Teresa?
So correct me if I'm wrong on this assumption. If we left it as farm forest and then later through an economic analysis review determined that perhaps something was necessary to be done out there, then it would go through another vetting process and full public comment and blah, blah, blah until, so that would, it would require all that to make another change.
Yes, under any of the 1 through 3 options, that process has to take place. The question and the way we had started with this original policy was, we had that previous policy. Did we want to sort of capture any of that previous policy and encapsulate it in the current comp plan policy that would guide that future effort in an explicit way in the comp plan? It doesn't have to happen that way. And so, under option 1 and deleting the policy, the comp plan is just silent on that. That whole body of work is still out there, still can be a starting point for the next annexation plan. But given the time gap that is likely to occur before that happens, we would probably be starting over on a lot of it.
Don?
This would be a total restart, kind of regardless of what we do here. As I look at the 1 through 4, I kind of look at number 2, because it seems like number 2 sort of bookmarks what we did. Because we made extensive recommendations in an IGA that said, if you build this West Hayden Island development, the following considerations should be considered and mitigated for. That's kind of where we ended up. We didn't end up saying, let's make it an open space. We ended up saying, if we're going to do this, let's do it right and do it in a balanced way. And number 2 seems to kind of be the best archaeology on our process. And so I lean towards that.
Howard?
I agree with what you said, Don, in terms of permanently protect. Those are important words to hear. I also think it's very important that whatever we do, if we keep it in, provides very substantially for mitigation as time goes forward. Those are the 2 issues for me. Having said that, I would be comfortable with staff's recommendation as a perhaps alternative to the more specific proposal that you guys are offering that probably eliminates tangling with Metro and permanently protects what we're after and allows mitigation for anything else going forward.
Mike?
Well, I agree with Don. One of the concerns about deleting the policy and the bullets is that it does remove that work that we did do. And I'm thinking, I don't know why we couldn't go with number 2. We can still direct council to pursue changes with Metro in addition to that. It doesn't preclude that.
It just seemed to me as though number 2 was the kindest to both sides of this issue. And it was really, it kind of goes right to the balanced approach and balanced decision that we made. That's kind of why I'm there, Andre.
Karen?
So this is such an important issue, and I think a lot of us spent an awful long time having big discussions about West Hayden Island. And so I'm just going to amend 2 things I heard. Therese asked the question I was going to ask, which was, do you come back and ever re-look at this again? Or is this a 25-year or 30-year decision? But I also heard you say, Tom, that this is going to, that every 5 years or whatever, we're going to be looking at designations and how we're doing with providing what the city needs in order for us to meet our obligations to the people that live here. So I was really glad to hear the answer to that. And then number 2 was the one that I had supported before Don said anything. I was just hoping somebody was going to say yes to that one because of all the conversation we had regarding the community and being able to, the health impacts that we talked about and the different communities that were impacted. And I would fear that all of that information that was so heartfelt and came about would get lost. So I would prefer that to any of the other options.
This may surprise you, but actually, I am for number 1, and I'll tell you why. Yeah, we've. I guess we've been through a lot on West Hayden Island, but we are going to have to, whoever touches that island again, the west side of it, is going to have to go and baseline and work with the community all over again. Surely they will look and read what we did, but it will be more ghost than reality. There will be a different set of players, different commission, different, I mean, everything's going to be different. And it will be a ghost outline maybe of a process, but not of conclusions. And so I'm more in the camp of let's just delete the whole thing. We need to go to Metro one way or the other and have a conversation about area maps and land anyway. I mean, whether we do it with West Hayden Island on the point of and Polcom or something else, we have a land problem, and Mike's pointed this out for years and years, and we need to have that discussion. And it's appropriate to use West Hayden Island as that forum to encourage council, as Chris has suggested through a recommendation in a letter, to say, let's go talk to Metro about this in an informative way and have a good discussion about it and work to some kind of solution versus kind of having something that to me really doesn't mean anything. That fact that we need to have mitigation, we need to have that. Yeah, we do, but the next group may, and laws may be different, and the conditions will be different, and we just need to, I guess, give them their own rope, so to speak, and we can certainly maybe help them by doing more with Metro and trying to solve the problem before it gets there. So, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm confused. By putting these 4 bullet points, isn't that giving guidance to planners 25 years down the road? Like, isn't that the guidance in these 4 bullet points,
We are.
as opposed to handing a memo that's just going to get lost.
No, the memo is going to Metro.
Oh, okay.
The guidance would be going to Metro, as Chris said, to look at this in the broader context of West Hayden Island and really what's the underlying zoning and use of that property in the UGB. That's the real question. And you get to that broader question of industrial, you can have a broader discussion, I think, when you start talking about that relative to industrial land, because that's going to be the central question on the table. Is that potential industrial land in the future, or could it be an open space or some mix of that? Yes.
And what exactly are we asking of Metro? To change their minds?
Well,
Are we going to be asking Metro to say, oh, we made a mistake by insisting that West Hayden Island be used at least in part for industrial development? I don't see that happening. I really don't.
I'd love to look into the future, 25 years out from now, and see what really does happen on West Hayden Island. That it turns into a third runway of the airport in terms of economic development, and you all are going to look like whatevers. But it's a fascinating conversation. Right?
Gary.
Projecting into the future what you all think is right.
Gary.
Yeah, Tom, you were saying, if I heard you right, to my surprise, that there's less clarity around, was it around the industrial land designation by Metro than, there was something that was not
So
clear.
as the memo points out, there's 2 areas where West Hayden Island comes up in the Metro functional plan. Title IV under which was the original sort of, 1980 when they brought it in, or 83 when they brought it into the UGB, they said future industrial area. And then in the, I guess it's in the 90s when they did Title 13 and started looking at the natural resource lands, then they slapped it on top and said, oh, wait a minute, this is also important natural resource area.
Right.
And they overlaid that designation without saying, and they're not want to mandate to locals, do this here, but rather they said, no, it's important for both, and the city and the port should do an area plan and figure out that balance. And so what Metro is expecting is for the city and the port to come back with an area plan that says this is the balance. The last time we tried, we had 300, 500 acres was the balance.
That worked well.
So I'm not sure what we would ask Metro to do, or that they would necessarily, they're not inclined to, and they're quite sensitive, especially to the other jurisdictions and us too, of mandating and saying, no, in this area, on this part of the map, it has to be this. They would much rather we say, Metro, it's going to be this, adjust your plans accordingly.
And then they can agree with it.
Or not, or say, fix this part.
So just a couple of things. We're getting long on time. So do we have to make a decision on West Hayden Island today?
It would help. I mean, the red line version of the recommended plan is coming your way. We need to know what the red line version of Policy 641 should look like.
So we're just going to have a couple more comments, and then we're going to try to figure this out.
Well, so it seems to me if any form of 641 is going to stay in for this round, we should at least add the human health bullet to it. I think probably agreement on that. It seems to me the meta question we want to ask Metro is, hey, if you haven't noticed, Portland's running out of land, and there are uses that just don't intensify, right? I mean, parkland doesn't intensify. To some degree, harbor lands don't intensify, and we're going to try and push the intensity as far as we can, but, at some point, we stop meeting growth in all categories. What do you expect us to do about that, right? I mean, that's the meta question for Metro, and there ought to be some discussion at some point about that.
Michelle?
Suggestion that if there's a memo or something that suggests in some incarnation number 4 in an open space designation, that there be a discussion with the city attorney about regulatory takings before you do that.
Joe?
I didn't catch that.
I would investigate whether or not the city attorney thinks changing West Hayden Island to an open space designation would be a regulatory taking before you go down that path.
Yeah. Joe?
We'd like to go there, but I don't think we're headed there.
Of the choices, the choice that I think most accurately reflects sort of your all's deliberation before and sort of where we are now, and actually sort of the feedback we are getting from City Council by the fact we're not taking it up, is number 1. It doesn't change anything about the current assumptions or the status of West Hayden Island. It does mean that we go back and do it again if and when we ever do it. And it can't be confused with a direction to go back and do it, because that's not exactly what anyone decided. It strikes me as the one that's most consistent with the fact that we're finding that one of the plain truth things is we don't think a facility, that decision or a facility will be in place within the timeline of this plan, so we do not want to assume it for the purposes of this plan. So we're leaving it like it is today, with all the protections that it comes with today and all the decision-making process that it would have today.
Don?
Do we need to vote on this?
Yes.
I'd like to propose a motion. I move that we go with number 1 due to its clarity and lack of confusion. And I would hope for a second, in the spirit of less confusion.
So I need to confirm something before I vote. So in terms,
Before, we just need to have a second.
I'll second it.
Okay, second. Okay, now go.
so the current, because we don't have the map in front of us, so the current map designation, it doesn't show any division between that 300, 500.
Right.
It does not show any division. Okay.
It's late.
Okay, and then would there be, so having just farm forest, would there be any need to add on that, any of those community impact policies? I mean, we're not going to have a policy, so it would just be the map. Okay,
Square one.
okay.
Joe?
The difference between the future planning commission that considered this and our current commission and the future planners that are going to do it is that they're going to be doing it on the basis of the new comprehensive plan.
That's right.
And the new comprehensive plan has environmental justice built into it. So all those things that you all are reviewing that are community benefits, environmental justice, the inclusion of health, all that kind of policy is the new lens that will be applied to it in the future. So I think there is that in the decision-making of the future and in the record of what the city's intent is for a decision like this.
Mike?
At one point, my recollection was there was some discussion about referring to Metro's functional plan. This does not include that.
No.
There's no reference. It's just like off. Okay.
We passed.
That's a huge issue, especially if we're going to remove 6.41. So with that, okay.
Other discussion? None. Julie? Oh, Gary.
I just want to clarify what the motion is. Did I hear you say number 1?
The motion is number 1. Approve number 1.
And silence.
Yep.
Beyond.
Silence on all the other issues because it acknowledges that the process is restarting with new participants.
Julie?
I'm abstaining.
Aye.
Aye.
Yes.
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 Yes. Motion passes.
Well, it was fun revisiting Hayden Island now in a brief manner, right, Mike? In a brief manner.
I can never get enough.
Hopefully, it's done. Finito. Well, there can't be much. We already saw it. It's one line.
Okay, now we'll jump to number 1 in the memo, which is on page 2. There was some outstanding questions about the industrial land retention policy and what it covered. I think, Mike, you had a question about 6.38C and that, how those provisions would impact, how identifying and analyzing future regulations and what the effect on capacity, industrial capacity will be, and how we limit those impacts. And
Right.
and
Actually, 6.38B.
B.
B. Okay. They're both related.
Right.
And I think all along what we've been saying is, with all of these policies, when you balance them and when we have a decision to adopt a regulation or change the map, we're going to make findings against this policy, and we're going to make findings against the environmental policies in Chapter 7, and you're going to see that conflict in some cases, and this is just a prompt to address and acknowledge those impacts, that this conversion, this regulation, this whatever is going to have this impact. Can we do something to limit it? And if it has that impact within that context, what value, environmental value, what other policy are we in conflict? And you're going to have to make a choice. But at least this policy is a prompt to acknowledge that impact, acknowledge that loss or that inability to mitigate, or to mitigate through other investments, pump more money into the brownfield program or whatever it is, that trade-off to get whatever outcome in that decision in front of you is.
Yeah, and the key is that this relates to industrial land retention, which absolutely I support. If it in fact is a two-pronged approach to look at the environmental issues, the concern I have is the way this reads, and especially given our just the conversation we had with regard to lack of industrial land, there will be a huge push to basically do away with environmental regulations in industrial land. I mean, that's the reality in terms of how it would be applied. So that's my concern with this language.
Comment?
Michelle?
Okay, so I'm looking at this, and I still have concerns about the different verbs, but I'm assuming when we get the glossary back and the expanded discussion of the balancing, that will address that, because right now, protect and prohibit, there's inconsistency, and limit is a lower level action than prohibiting. Striving is lower level. So I think there'll be refinement when we get the draft back. To clarify, this would only apply in those places specifically limit listed. So it only applies in the harbor, the corridor, and Brooklyn Yard?
Correct.
Or is the map? Okay. So maybe this is not the right time to ask the question, but I'm gonna-
There is a map in the Chapter 6 that defines the geography of the prime industrial land.
Okay.
It is those areas, the harbor, the corridor, Brooklyn Yard.
Okay, so a general question I'm going to throw out on. So if you look at something like the proposed Right to Dream move to the inner East Side industrial area, and I assume taking industrial land and using it for residential use. Is that correct?
I don't know.
Making that a campground?
I think it's under the bridge.
It
So
could
what's
be
that
right
zone?
away. It could be right away. So
Yeah.
Okay.
there is
So-
no.
Well, it is right
capacity.
away, and
Right.
it's called something other than a residential
Yeah,
use.
it's in the
a
right of way.
Public, it's a service use. That's how the Right to Dream 2 is where it
Okay.
is today.
So that's just a general question I'm throwing out there about how we protect the
And
industrial land.
just to be clear, the Central East Side is
Is not
not
in that
in
list,
this
right, so, right,
area.
that's why I said it
Yeah,
doesn't
it's a
apply here
separate
if that's
issue.
just
Yeah.
there. But in terms of industrial land retention, when I read that in the paper, that triggers that question for me.
Yeah.
How are we being consistent in preserving it?
Mike?
Another point on 638E, has Portland Parks and Recreation weighed in on that one, just out of curiosity? I'm not thinking so much about parks, but trail connectivity, and that's been a big issue, I know, with industrial lands.
So E is coming from the Metro Title IV and what they say to do with regionally significant industrial land and other industrial land. And Metro actually has gone through this and does carve out, it's sort of trails are not parks, they're transportation facilities kind
Right.
of thing. And they went through a whole case down in Tualatin and the Tonkin Trail and all of that to clarify that trails are not parks.
Okay.
For 6.38D, the language seems a little bit weaker than the rest. Strive to offset. I mean, is it for D?
D, yeah.
Is off? I mean, why not just offset?
Mainly for the issues that Mike's raising is
Yeah.
does is
Does it
you know,
impact
the
your-
verb, is it trump, how hard is it? You know, it's
Okay.
that it's acknowledging that we are not going to be able to offset everything every
Yeah.
time.
Okay.
So we're going to try our best, but it's not a hard trumping policy, and that's not the structure or the framework of the policies.
This really, policy as you've described, really is taking kind of a prompt for whoever's reading this to go back and look at a series of other policies around parks and trails and environmental overlays and things to look at the balancing of those policies relative to the industrial land need and say, you know, where is that balance relative to the need for the jobs and the prosperity, to whether or not you put an overlay, there's an overlay needed or some protection or something else, and have that conversation.
I would say not go back and look, but
Okay.
in the future proposals that
Proposals,
come
yeah.
forward, to look at that and have that
Okay.
conversation. Does it need to be there in that location? For what reasons? And did you consider the impact to industrial land capacity when you decided that, yes, it does need to be there?
There, okay. Okay. Other conversation? Are we comfortable with this?
Okay?
Comfortable,
Okay.
Mike? Okay.
You okay?
I'm good.
Good?
Okay, the next item was number 5 in your packet on page 11. This is in response, just a little follow-up to testimony we heard last time at the EOA hearing regarding some properties at the edge interface of the East Columbia neighborhood that are, and this is really under the current comprehensive plan. These properties in this area are zoned are RF, rural farm forest, but they have a comp plan designation of industrial sanctuary. And it's been that way for many, many years, even predating the 1980 comp plan. It's just that nobody's ever moved forward. There are existing houses on them. The existing access into the site is through the East Columbia Neighborhood Association, which is one of the reasons why we haven't proposed to change the zoning to conform to that industrial designation, because anything to move this industrial forward, we would assume is master planned by these other properties, much in the way that these other areas in this area have master planned, with some sort of street access that brings that through the industrial area and not through the, any zone change to proposal to industrial would have to address the industrial traffic through this residential neighborhood. The other issue that we considered is, again, what you heard in testimony and what we've heard across the city is this whole interface between residential areas and industrial areas. And the fact that changing this industrial designation to a residential designation, even to an R20 designation, brings those residences and more residences closer to the industrial area and the noise and the impacts of that. And so sort of wanting to not bring those conflicts closer together and leaving it up to a future zone change process to resolve those potential conflicts and the buffer with the neighborhood is why we have not proposed any change to this designation.
Mike?
Which makes sense, but I will ask, is there any e-zoning over that?
Yeah,
part?
what
No.
you see here
That's
is the
green.
E-zone map. So
Right.
the dark green is the P zone, the preservation zone.
Right.
And the light green is the C zone along that corridor.
Got it, okay.
And just, there's an aerial view of what's out there today.
So those things down to the south are trucks.
Right.
See there?
This is the existing truck terminals, yeah.
And your recommendation?
No change.
No change, yeah.
Are we comfortable with that?
Sure.
Yep.
Yes.
Three other issues that are in the memo. First up, next was 6, accuracy of employment forecasts and, past historical forecasts. There's a little bit of data. We have 2 sort of good vintage forecasts from Metro. One from 1985 that looked at from 85 to 2005 that was actually pretty good. It was 3% low. The one from 2000 is not, because we had the Great Recession in the middle of it. And it also shows, the timing of the forecast, that when you do 2000 was at the top of a business cycle. Hey, things are going great. Run it out. And then you take your snapshot. Oh, how are we doing? Well, we're at the bottom of a business cycle. That wasn't too good. So that's a little, it just, and it goes to speak that in general, the Metro forecasts for population growth have been more accurate, and the employment, the economic forecasts are more volatile. No one could really predict the depths of the Great Recession coming forward, and the speediness or lack of the recovery. So again, there's a lot more volatility, which is why we need to do this kind of stuff more than every 20 years. So I think that was just an information point. I'm not sure if there's questions or that it prompts necessarily a policy change. It just reinforces the need to do a better job of tracking this. I think the EOA now gives us that foundation to measure that performance and to track that performance through the business cycle.
Okay. Howard, did you have a question?
Yeah, just a comment on the need to be flexible, to be nimble. Those 2 forecasts are in stunning, cooperation with each other around an unforeseen event. One went as planned, terrific. One didn't, not so good. And I think in the future, there'll be more not so goods than predictables. And so I think it's good to pay attention to flexibility and nimbleness if you can, and not be stuck with these long-range numbers.
Other comments? Other questions? Good. All right.
Okay, the next item on page 13, number 7, was there was just some outstanding questions about the employment to open space map changes that, we are going back and looking at sort of the acquisitions, the public agency acquisitions that have taken place over the last 20 years, trying to true up the zoning with those. There's a couple of tables that sort of explain who's doing the acquiring, how big those parcels are. There was a specific prompt to go back and look like, the industrial land capacity loss associated with those. As I characterized before and as the analysis shows, out of almost 900 acres of gross land area, these are wetlands and floodplain and steep slopes, and there's only 36 acres of capacity. Most of that is tied up in Thomas Cully Park, and I think this is an exact situation where there was a community evaluation and decision that we wanted more parkland in that park deficient area, and that's what we're going to go within that location. And so I guess we're pretty comfortable with where these, 900 acres, that's a lot, but there's not a lot of real potential there without a lot of infill of wetlands, a lot of expense and mitigation, et cetera.
That was actually
that goes
the
with
comment I
this.
was going to make in terms of retention. Neither the city nor Metro are going out and buying prime industrial land. They're buying the marginal land, they're buying the wetlands, they're buying the stream corridors. So,
Question?
Yes. Michelle.
So it sounded like some of the industrial land is within a park, and so I can see where that's not usable really at all. Are there small parcels that are accessible?
There could be. I mean, when we looked at this, there's slivers, but they tended to be in the sort of 1 to 2 acre capacity, or less than an acre of capacity in terms of those slivers, the upland portions of the sites. And I think one of the things that the body of policies, especially as it applies to future acquisitions, is to, when there is that kind of proposal, to actually look at that and say, okay, there's 2 acres or 5 acres of buildable land on this site. Do you really need that for your park's open space, stormwater use, facility use, or can we somehow partition that off and spin it back out to make it available for employment land use? And that's what that policy prompt forces, that question as part of that decision-making process.
And so my only question would be, with any of these 36, are there places where we think we would push back now and say, well, can you carve out that little piece?
Our reanalysis of this was that no, other than really looking at Thomas Cully Park and revisiting that decision, which I don't think we want to do, that there weren't that's a really good opportunity there, we should.
Or even a medium
Right.
opportunity. I'm not picky at this point.
Other questions?
Okay, and
We're
then the
good.
last item was just a for your information item on the campus institution zone change project. That's how we're capturing all of that extra capacity for our hospitals and colleges. There's information in this staff report, as well as we included the concept plan report that's floating out in the community for what is essentially going to be 2 new base zones in the zoning code, one for hospitals and urban colleges like PCC Cascade or PCC Southeast, and then a second zone for what we call residential colleges, campuses, the University of Portland's, the Reed Colleges, the Lewis and Clark's, and we've been working with an advisory group, a work group, to help us craft those proposals. We will have a discussion draft out in the community this summer, and this will actually be coming to you in October as part of the Task 5 implementation projects. But since this information was available and it's a big part of our meeting our capacity shortfall, we thought we would provide it to you up front. There's not necessarily any guidance needed from you at this time, but if you had any questions.
So just homework to prepare you, to get you up to speed for the fall consideration.
Fall consideration.
Growing encroachment by institutions is a neighborhood concern, has been for years. Why isn't that kind of a bullet point here? Continued interaction with neighborhood groups.
So we're doing that on two ways. One is we are, in essence, we're allowing the campuses to grow, have more freedom to grow on their existing campus boundary. And we're making it harder for them to expand laterally. It will take a comprehensive plan amendment for them to expand their boundaries. So that we want them to grow up, not out. And that will be one of the issues addressed. The other one is sort of within the zoning code, the taking some of what is in the multifamily zones in terms of notification of developments, and especially on the edges of campus, and requiring that notification process for the surrounding neighborhood, incorporating that into these new base zones. And I think that those issues are more fully addressed in the concept plan report.
There's also an ongoing provision in the new proposal for transportation impact reviews that involve neighborhood public participation as well. So there is, as Tom said, there's quite a bit of neighborhood interface related proposals that are in that concept plan. We just didn't choose to highlight them in this particular memo.
But we will get the look at that next year, correct?
In the
Or in the fall?
A couple months from now.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Great.
Okay, that's all I had.
Mike?
What?
Not that I really want to get into it. Did I miss something? Did we have our conversation about goal 9 and I was asleep or something?
We did not.
I guess I will ask a question about it, and that is, given the methodology, given the decisions we made, we are not foreseeing a need to seek a goal 9 exception at this point. I think that's the bottom line, right?
Right, and I think what in the staff report explains on page 10 is we would be charting new territory with a goal 9 exception, because most times it's done when cities want to expand onto farmland and saying why they need that, as opposed to, gee, we don't want to expand over there for these reasons. Right. And the combination of decisions right now leads us that we don't need to make that case. I think that the most, if we went with a higher cargo forecast for the marine terminal need, we would probably need to take an exception to explain why West Hayden Island wasn't available within the time frame.
Okay, that's good. I'm just wanted to close the loop. Hole.
Good. So consent list?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the next item is we wanted to just update you on the consent list, and you may have noticed we give you another list of map and policy amendments for your consideration, and that basically was what we hope is the 99% done version. There still may be one or two miscellaneous things we catch at the last minute, but for the most part, you've now received all of the staff recommendations that come out of us having read all of the testimony through the end of the comment period. And that took the form of two lists, one policy list and one map list. In the map list, we also included a recap of where we ended up when we applied the non-conforming framework that you reviewed. So if you want to check our work on how the non-conforming sites played out, you can look at that list as well. So as with the earlier consent lists, what we'd like to have you do is flag items that you want to talk about. We have, a tiny bit of time today just to get clarity on what this exercise is about. And then we also have time on the May 26th agenda to continue that discussion. It isn't the last bite at the apple, because when you do get the actual strike through and underline, there'll be one final pass at your ability to request further amendments to that draft. But May 26th is essentially the last time which we'll have a more informal discussion of specific items that you raise. And as of today, I believe I have a couple items that folks have emailed us about that we would expect to talk about on the 26th. Commissioner Rudd flagged a couple things in Chapter 5 that we would bring back. Commissioner Hauk had flagged policy 6.38, which we talked about today, so that I'm checking that one off. Commissioner Oxman has had some back and forth with staff about policy 9.6, which PBOT is continuing to attempt to answer your questions, and if they don't in writing, that there'll be opportunity on the 26th to talk about that.
Yeah, we're still in process on
Yeah.
that one and all.
Right. So we'd hope to answer your questions, but if it isn't clear by the 26th, that's fair game to discuss. And then Chair Ba, you had flagged policy 7.32 for follow-up in an email earlier.
Yep.
So that's what I have right now on the table. I haven't received lists from all of you yet, so if you are wanting to do that, I think we had asked for that. Julie, was that the 15th? Yeah, so that's, you still have a few days.
Eric, do you prefer that we email you about that or talk about it now or what?
Email is easier. That way I can cut and paste from your email into this list. And as before, we'll pair it back to the list of what we've received on probably the Friday or the Monday before the 26th, so that you know what we're going to talk about during that session.
And to follow up, I had some contact with the folks on the Anti-Displacement Coalition, and it looked like from the list that a lot of their concerns had been addressed in some form, and I just wanted to see what your sense of that was and whether I should further mark those. I'm going to review that memo and.
I think in some form is the right word. We haven't necessarily verbatim followed every one of those recommendations, but we have met with them a couple times now, and we are close to being able to send them back a draft of how we're addressing their specific issues and get verification on whether they believe that we've done that. So, you know, you're also going to see exactly how we've done that on the strike through and underline draft, but I think it's correct to say right now we believe we've addressed many of their policy issues, but we're still talking.
And that draft will be out before the 26th?
No, the only thing the draft, the strike through and underline draft, we're projecting around June 1.
Oh, okay.
So May 26th is the last session before that draft, so that we can inform what we put in that draft.
Yeah.
Then June 9th and June 23rd, you'll talk about that draft. And so if to use the displacement example, you could flag it for the 26th if you want to ask us more questions, or you could wait to see what the strike through and underline looks like on June 1 and then talk about it on June 9th or June 23rd.
Okay, so did I hear you say that there'll be a written memo back to them about these topics, or?
Yeah, because we've been meeting with them, we committed to share with them a first staff draft before we recommended something to you. So we're trying to coordinate that and give them a peek
So we
at the
won't see a
draft.
version of that until the June 1 red line?
Correct.
Okay.
But we will, before June 1, and we will have met with that group again and gone over our draft with them, and so you'll be able to, we'll give you information about how that went.
Thank you.
Joe?
Yeah, I'm just we should take a look at whether or not we can bring something back on the 26th, given the complexity and the prominence of the issue, but let us take a look at what's possible.
Okay. Maggie?
Yeah, I would just be curious as to how their policies, I think it was 11, line up with the adjustments that you're gonna put in, like how the language matches up and if it matches up across all 11 policies. And I assume it's not written out. These are pretty vague kind of suggestions on their policy areas. So the design of the actual language will come later.
But we've got a draft that we're reviewing internally on how we intend to respond to their policy suggestions, and we had committed to sharing it with them before bringing a recommendation back to you, but we will be doing that.
And I would be interested in their responses to what you offer so that we get a kind of a balanced look at one side and the other. Thank you.
I know Karen's also been meeting with, I think everybody has. So, and I know they're going to come the 26th at the hearing to do a couple of things in terms of do their 3 minutes for just a quick presentation. I think 3 of them are going to try to get in a row. If we could, and I know, at least have a draft understanding of how we're responding, it would be helpful at that time.
Just to clarify, are you speaking of the final hearing?
Yes.
So yeah, the only remaining hearing you have is currently, I believe it's June 23rd.
Yeah.
So that would be the hearing on the scenarios report.
And they're going to come and testify.
Yeah, and there is a section, that's fair game, because there is a section of the scenario report that talks about affordable housing and what we're doing, so that's fine.
So I'm a little bit concerned about this push because this issue is so complex, and that we're hearing from one side and not others, and that actually this is a prominent issue across the community right now in terms of the affordability of housing in Portland, period, and gentrification as well. And they're related, but they're different. So I'm not exactly sure how to get those other voices and get this debate into our comprehensive plan. But that's part of what's going on right now. And it's not that one side's wrong or one side's right, but there are provisions in both that make sense. And the upshot of both is to try to get there's implications that I don't think our creating of this policy are grappling with, which is one implication is you don't grow. Second implication is that you increase the cost of development. And not that those are wrong, but that's, we can just go with advocacy and add policy, or we can take this out and give it a close look. And I'm just worried that we're not doing the latter, so.
You just said both sides. So you said both sides of affordability issues, or both? Or
No, and that was a misspeaking. It's a side that's proposing, like the program that we have from the coalition, which is looking at ways to extract value from development to spend back on community benefits, to capture some things that they think are community values and bring that back to the community. That is, like I say, that makes sense. That's a whole point of view. Also, what we've learned from other cities, and what's sort of a national trend too, is that the cost of housing is going up because demand exceeds supply. So a lot of the same provisions we're fighting about come into clamping down on the amount of development, or making it expensive in a way that could, in effect, clamp down on the amount of development. So there's a balance point here, that's all. And a list of 11 different ways of extracting value from a development is either you're going to get little bits of all 11, or it's just there's only so much money there, and that's what we're learning from the bonus study, which we're bringing back in some time in the next few weeks. So I'm a little just worried that the arguments are sound on all sides. Our math is silly, and I just want to have us all see that, to acknowledge it. So
The staff's math.
the math of trying to get so much out of one pot. That's really the fiction we're telling ourselves, is that this pot is bottomless, and it won't affect development. The pot's not bottomless, and it will affect development, and one can choose to do that. And that's the choice you all should be presented with.
The bottom line, I think, is that there are several points of view on what the best way is to achieve affordable housing and avoid displacement. And so you've got several programs in the body of testimony that you've received, and we need to grapple with those different programs. They aren't all exactly aligned.
Mike?
So to Joe's point, I'm very interested in, when you said there, there's another side, is there somebody representing that other side, or you just described your own concern or the Bureau's concern over the issues you raise? We need to hear that along with this stuff, obviously, to do our job.
Well, and it's not another side so much as the complete story.
Yeah,
The one,
right.
they're operating
We
in the
need the
same
complete story.
context. Yeah, it's not a binary thing at all.
Yeah.
So could I come back? Is it possible for you to line up again, maybe their 11 policies, what is currently in the comp plan related to affordable housing strategies, whether that's just, anti-displacement strategies, as well as when you come up with a better idea of, your memo to them, put that in there as well, kind of a crosswalk. So we kind of have that to look at. And then secondly, I know at previous meetings we had discussed like what's the implication for land use decisions, like what is appropriate to keep in the plan. So what maybe the city attorney or any other attorneys you're consulting, what their opinion is on that, using value capture, like what implications that has for a land use decision and having it in the comp plan.
Yeah, we're directly dealing with that right now through the city attorney, and we actually have a meeting with the displacement group and their attorneys and our attorneys later this week to specifically talk about that question. So we'll be in a better position by next month to report out on the substance of that debate and that discussion.
Okay.
I would just echo what Mike and Joe have said. I think we need a very complete picture. I know, we've certainly given voice to the affordable housing, anti-displacement groups in front of us, and given them hopefully leadership to get out and voice their concerns. And we recognize the importance, but I think we need a complete picture from what are the implications of the policies that they're proposing in terms of not only cost, but the market realities of a supply and demand. And are we, we probably can't control supply and demand, or we can't affect it, but we need that complete picture. And I think the better we can get that, as Joe's described, I think we'll make a better decision around affordable housing and addressing, I think, the concerns. Joe?
I feel like I didn't want to pitch one side against the other, but one of the things when you lay the context that becomes clear, and actually there's a coalition right now in the city working on this very topic, is that you can extract public benefit from development. You can get some, and there's a variety of ways to do it, and there's a variety of ways who controls it. All those are just choices you make. And some of that can go to help create affordable housing. But at the local level, we know between federal resources and other resources, you need to just find more resources to build affordable housing. And some can come from development, some needs to come from other sources. And both of those policies strike me as relevant to the comprehensive plan, not just sort of focusing that there's a developer to extract it from.
Well, I think that's the complete picture to me is, it's what other, kind of use that term, sweat do we have to do to make this work as a complete process?
Yeah, and I
love
think
that term.
I think there's really numerous studies, like for example, one out of the Furman Center out of New York, out of NYU, that said, it's not just inclusionary zoning, it's not just Section 8 vouchers. It's none of these one policies are the silver bullet. It's actually putting them in there so that they can be used for use. And I think part of the argument here would be, actually have a fairly balanced story, and I think a balanced picture is that, the balanced picture, market-driven and people driving, private developers leading development, has been in a lot of our zoning already, and that's kind of the status quo. Wouldn't you? In terms of not as now that it's being pushed to have more affordable housing policies to make up for that existing private market driving development.
Other comments, questions?
If there are no more specific questions about the consent list, I can move on to just an update on the next few sessions and what the sequence of discussion is.
Tell us when we're going to be done.
Yeah, so working backwards, on July 14th is our current target for when you actually have a vote to recommend the recommended comp plan. I'll look forward to the analogies made during that discussion. To remind you what you're actually voting on, you're voting on a couple things at that stage. You'll be voting on the map, the policy document, the citywide system plan, the revised version, the TSP project list, and the EOA and the scenario reports. That's the entire package that moves on to City Council. And you've been moving through these bits as we've gone.
July 14th.
So that's the final vote. What we're doing next session on May 26th is wrapping up these consent discussions, tying up any other loose ends that we've committed to tying up, like we had committed to Commissioner Schultz to discuss the full block zoning and the merits of full or partial block commercial zoning. We owe Chris a broadband open data discussion. I've got a list of, no, that's May 26th at the moment. So there's a set of those miscellaneous discussions that we will bring and package together and make staff presentations on, and we'll be providing you with several additional memos from staff between now and the 26th to support that discussion. On June 9th, then, and June 23rd, by then you'll have received the strike through and underline policy draft, and we'll also show you the current status of the map holistically again. Because you only changed one map thing today, the map is pretty much done at this stage, so we ought to be able to get that out pretty soon. You will then have an opportunity to essentially make motions for further amendments if there's something you don't like in either the map or the projects or in the policy text. And hopefully we've done our job through these work sessions so that the amount of commissioner amendments is minimal, but we don't know until you read the document, and you won't know until you read the document. And so that's why we have it over the span of 2 sessions, because the comp plan doesn't have a monopoly on your time, and you're also getting the Southeast Quadrant hearings during that time period. So there'll be 2 different sessions, and we're metering out so you have a little time to think between the topics. And then on June 23rd, we have the scenario report hearing as well on that date. And as Commissioner Bob pointed out, that's kind of a last call for that is a hearing, so folks could testify about really anything that relates to how well we're doing with this. Is it delivering on our Portland Plan goals? And you will get a copy of that scenarios report to review on May 18th, which is a little less than a week from now. We're just wrapping up that work now. And the public will get notice of that too, because it's a hearing. The other thing that we'll do on May 26th is remind you of the process for how we're going to run the amendments process. And just briefly today, I can give you a preview of that, and that is that we would, similar to how we do the call for consent items that you want to pull, we would essentially ask that like the Friday before each of those meetings that you provide us with a list of anything that, any amendments you want to make, so that we can tee it up in a clear, essentially a ballot, so that we can work efficiently through it, and so you don't get confused about what you're voting on. And we'll group like things together. And since there'll be 2 dates, we can have 2 deadlines, so if you don't, you'll get a second wave of things. You don't have to turn everything in on the first shot. We'll also, on May 26th, ask you to, we'll spend a little bit of time going around the room asking you to disclose of all the offline meetings you've had with different stakeholders in this discussion. So, you know, an example is those of you who've met recently with the displacement group, you ought to disclose that you've done that and say something very basic about what the nature of that discussion is. And this is for the benefit of public transparency, so that folks know what discussions have had and they have an opportunity to rebut that, especially when this gets to council. So there's a variety of that. Probably practically all of you have had some kind of meeting with somebody with a stake in this. So it doesn't need to be, you know, it doesn't need to be mentioning every time someone has randomly talked to you about the comp plan on the bus, but it needs to be, if you've really had a substantive meeting with an organized group that has a stake in this, or a substantial financial interest in an outcome of one of your MAP sessions or something. So that's happening on the 26th. And we will have the city attorney present at the executive session, Chair Ba, this week, in case there are questions about sort of that kind of issue. We can prep for that then.
Okay, great.
Eric, on the disclosure, those are things that are directly related to comp plan exclusively?
Yeah, it doesn't have to do with propane or the former West Hayden Island process, or,
Okay.
or other things that might be before you, but yeah, specifically comp plan.
Okay.
And is there a format for disclosure? Like, do you have to do date and time in person, or is it more casual?
We'll try and get guidance on that before the 20, that's something we might do this week, is just make a list of what we like. Probably it's who and what and when is the format, but we'll give you a little more guidance.
Along those lines, are we talking about, I don't know if you can help me now or not, but is that is an email versus sitting down over coffee or whatever it is? Somebody sent an email.
Yeah. No, I think we're.
My life, Mike.
We assume you get lots of emails, but no, this is more of a discussion of substance with a party.
That's helpful, yeah. Teresa? Well, I think we're done unless you have.
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay, this is just relating to that Eastmoreland discussion, and I think we really need to help educate the public about the difference in the code changes versus the zoning map changes, because clearly I think maybe they don't quite get the whole picture of how much help that R7, R5 thing would be versus actually making changes in code that are going to affect the real issues that are bothering them. So I don't know if we have like a one-pager or just something.
We can work on that communication.
Do you think that's a valid assessment, though?
Yeah, in a general sense, we're getting a lot of inquiries about just the relationship of the comp plan to the residential project and who's doing what and what can be affected by the code versus the map. And so we can work on communication around that. With the Eastmoreland thing, it was also an observation today that you all were a little bit confused by the motion process and what you were voting on. And so we'll do a couple things for the consent list. We'll definitely try and be very clear about that and give you options. We'll also, for the minutes for today, we'll make sure it gets written up in a clear way. So when you review the minutes next time, you might pay particular attention to how we portrayed your vote on Eastmoreland, so that we don't have any confusion.
So we're not confused by the minutes. Good.
And I want to take a moment, Mr. Chair, to acknowledge the audience who have so faithfully stayed to the end of the meeting, absorbing our every word. Thank you, Portland people, for being here.
Any other comments or questions? I think we resolved a lot today.
Yes, thank you. I think this is a productive meeting. We're well on our way to getting you an actual draft to review, so.
Good. Thank you. We're adjourned.
That was good work, really.